How's it going, everyone? Today I want to talk about the number one thing that kills asymmetrical horror multiplayer games. And maybe it's not what you'd usually expect, like a bad launch price, lack of content, or even poor communication from the developers. Now, although those can definitely hurt a game, what I want to focus on here is something deeper, something that keeps happening game after game to the point where it's almost like watching a slow motion train wreck every time. And it's important to note, I know there's a bunch of different factors that lead to the death of these games, okay? But in this video, I'm talking specifically about the fatal blow, the nail in the coffin, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Is that enough analogies to make my point? I'm talking about player agency, or more specifically the lack of it, especially in the killer role. This might sound a little abstract at first, but by the end of this video you'll see how this one problem connects almost every single asymmetrical horror game that has died over the past few years. Now, originally I was working on a retrospective of all the asymmetrical horror games that we lost in 2024, and yeah, there were a lot. Evil Dead the game, Killer Klowns from Outer Space, and Level 0 Extraction, to name a few of them, all of them gone, dead. And at first, I wanted to look at what went wrong for each individual game, but as I went through them, something started to stand out. Sure, each game had its own unique problems. Evil Dead was an Epic Games exclusive, Killer Klowns had a very steep price point for how niche of a license it was, and Level 0 struggled to find its audience because it had no identity due to cowardly decisions from the developers. So of course you could point out all of these surface level issues, but underneath all of that, there was one core problem that every single one of these games shared, and that even goes for older games like Video Horror Society as well. The killer role lacked player agency, and I'm going to explain why that leads to the game's death. Let me break this down. In every asymmetrical horror game, there are two sides: the killer, killers, or whatever the power role happens to be, and the survivors. For these games to work, both sides need to feel fun and rewarding. But here's the problem. When the killer role isn't strong enough, when it's too difficult or frustrating to play, people stop queuing up to play it. Once that happens, survivor queue times start to balloon. No one wants to sit in matchmaking for 10 to 15 minutes just to get one quick match, so they end up quitting too, and just like that, the entire game collapses. It's really that simple. That's why it's really the final blow, because it literally makes these games unplayable. It's really a simple formula. Weak killer equals long survivor queues equals dead game. And I think we're already starting to see the early stages of this with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So why does this keep happening? Why do developers keep making specifically the killer role so weak? Why is it never the other way around? You'd think they had learned by now, right? Well, after being part of the community for several of these now dead games, I noticed a few trends. First, casual players almost always prefer the survivor role. It's not hard to see why. Survivor is usually the more immersive role in these games, and the gameplay tends to feel less stressful. You're working together with a team, you have clear objectives, and even if you die, you're a part of a larger group. Meanwhile, the killer role is inherently more stressful. You're usually on your own, or at least responsible for the outcome of a match. It's often more competitive by nature, which means it tends to attract more competitive players. Now, here's where things get kind of tricky. Most developers want their games to appeal to the majority of players. So since the majority are survivors, the developers, who often lean more casual themselves, end up catering to that audience and balancing the game around that side. This leads to a situation where they make the killer role harder and harder under the assumption that competitive killer players will rise to the challenge. And to be fair, they often do. Competitive killer players are really good at adapting, even when the odds are stacked against them. But this creates an unintended side effect. It makes the killer experience miserable for anyone who isn't a die-hard competitive player. Over time, the killer players start dropping out, and when competitive players play the survivor role, they naturally exploit the imbalance, making the killer role even less appealing. It's a vicious cycle, and it's one I've seen play out over and over again. Another big part of the problem is what we all know in the asymmetrical community as tribalism. It's in every asymmetrical horror game. There's this divide between killer mains and survivor mains, and instead of working together to improve the game, the two sides end up arguing and blaming each other instead. And sometimes, to be honest, this tribalistic mentality, it burns me out and has me wanting to play other games entirely. Fortunately, with instantgaming.com, that's easier and cheaper than ever. So instead of arguing with anyone over bad balance choices, I can instead be playing 3-player co-op in Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine 2, or if I want to play something even more chill, I can pre-order Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 with a massive discount and just get immersed into an old school classic RPG. But on top of that, you can even enter in to win a free game of your choice using my affiliate links in the description below. So next time you're gonna buy a game anyway, head over to Instant Gaming, save yourself a huge chunk of money, and support the channel at the same time. But now let's get back to the topic on how tribalism in asym games has terrible consequences. Take Rush Week in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, for example. For those who don't know, Rush Week is a 6v1 mode where one player takes the role of the killer randomly while 6 others play as survivors. It's a really interesting mode, and I think it does a great job of capturing the classic horror movie feel. As a survivor, you actually had to respect the killer and play smart if you wanted to escape. But of course, some players didn't like that. They started complaining that the killer was too strong, and instead of looking at the data or considering the overall health of the game, the developers decided to nerf the killer. As a result, if you play Rush Week today, most killer players in Rush Week will either disconnect as soon as the match starts or just go AFK at the start. And the ones who do try to play are forced into really boring, repetitive strategies like hard camping objectives. They have no room for creativity, self-expression, and in other words, no player agency, right? If they try to go off script and play in a unique way, they will just get dumpstered and bullied. And this isn't just a problem for Rush Week, it's something that affects the main game mode too. And honestly, like I've said before, it's something I've seen in every failed asymmetrical horror game that I've been a part of. And the funny thing is, this is where Dead by Daylight actually stands above the rest. Now don't get me wrong, DBD has its share of issues, but one thing it does really well is give players agency. Whether you're playing killer or survivor, you usually feel like your decisions matter. If you lose, you can think back and identify what went wrong in the match, right? Maybe you wasted too much time chasing one survivor. Maybe you didn't manage your perks effectively going into the match. Either way, you feel like you could have done something differently. It makes you want to keep playing, improve, all because you as a player have agency over not just the outcome of a match, but the entire experience of a match from start to finish, right? And that's an important fact, right? It's not just about the outcome of winning or losing, it's about the experience of the entire match from start to end. In these other games, you don't get that. Instead, it feels like the developers are pulling the strings, deciding the outcome for you. You're not outplaying your opponents, you're just trying to survive a system that's stacked against you. The end result, the killer role loses all sense of player agency. You're not playing to express yourself or adapt to the situation. You're just playing to avoid losing. So what's the takeaway here? If I could send one message to asymmetrical horror game developers, it would be this: stop focusing so much on what the loudest players are saying on Reddit, look at the data, and focus on player agency above everything else, especially for the role that players are less interested in playing, because that's where the obvious issue lies. If you go the route of believing these are skill issues and not fundamental design flaws, your game will die just like all the others. And if we keep this trend going for too much longer, Jake Paul is probably going to end up challenging DBD to a boxing match soon. Anyway, with all that said, let's take a moment of silence for our fallen asyms. Let me know in the comments which of these asymmetrical horror games you were the most sad to see go in 2024. And as always, thanks for watching and have a good one.